We're in Stockholm, the capital city of Sweden, a very captivating city built on 14 islands in the Baltic Sea, famous too as the host city for the Nobel Prize ceremony. But this year is special. It's the centennial year. Laureates from down the years have gathered for the magnificent royal banquet in the town hall in the presence of King Gustav XVI and Queen Sylvia. Now, we've taken advantage of this gathering of genius to have a group of laureates join the centennial Nobel Science Debate. We're in the Parliament building, the second chamber of Sweden's historic Parliament building. It's a magnificent room decorated by frescoes from Swedish history. I'm Harold Evans, and welcome to the Centennial Nobel Science Debate. I'm joined today by 100 Nobel Science Laureates or more to talk about the relationship between science and our modern world. What can scientists do for this world? To help me answer, or attempt to answer, this question, we have a panel of 6 extremely brave people. The 6 laureates on the platform and numbers of others on the floor whom I hope will join this discussion. So let me introduce our panelists. There's leading from this side, Doug Osheroff, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1996. George Olah, chemistry in 1994. Mario Molino, chemistry in 1995. Eric Wischhaus, physiology and medicine in 1993. Leon Lederman, physics in 1988. And John Polanyi, chemistry in 1986. I'd like to get them all together sometime and make one great scientific experiment. But we're not going to be able to do it today. We have an experiment today in dialogue, if we can be crisp. And I'd like to ask all the panelists to say, summarize in their own words, what have we got out of 100 years of Nobel science? Leo?
Well, we should list, if you like, the capabilities that science has brought to humanity.
Yes, yes.
And in every aspect, in healthcare, in longevity, in travel, we can, people of ordinary means can cross the continents and oceans, and communications, and our access to information through the digital revolution, entertainment. Can you imagine that not too long from now, if not now already, you can sit in your living room and by the click of a mouse, you can call any book ever written in the world, translate it into your own language for your own enjoyment, and the same with music and poetry and art and so on. Access to these things, access to education, these are all capabilities. That their distribution is unfortunately not uniform is one of our problems, but the vast technology increasing at a pace which is almost disorienting is there too.
George?
The 20th century, I think, was really a tremendous advance for science. I don't believe that you can classify science as Nobel science or any national science. We are lucky that we got a prize, but it's not the most important thing. We are part of a generation who advanced science in a very significant way. And in my book, and I am a chemist, but I still think in my book, one of the major breakthroughs of this century was the harnessing of the energy of the atom. Now, unfortunately, this was connected with a bomb. But our benefactor, Alfred Nobel, also invented dynamite. And dynamite was used for many things. It was used, unfortunately, also to kill people. But it opened up the industrial world. It allowed to build roads, tunnels, harbors, and so on. So my conclusion is that the tremendous advances made in science hopefully should be used to the benefit of mankind. And I think we are making strides, where in many ways the danger that we will annihilate each other by dropping atom bomb at each other indiscriminately is past. Now, I hope we can also manage
We'll come to
terrorists and others.
Very good.
I think from my own personal experience, if I look back to the science that I've done, and I look back to the motivations, again, as many of us have pointed out, there's usually some simple, relatively simple scientific question. In my case with Christiane Nustein-Volhard and we were interested in the way that genes control the way embryos develop. And what we did and what ultimately resulted in the Nobel Prize was to identify genes in fruit fly embryo. This is a tiny, tiny little embryo, and in a certain sense a very simple problem. What we didn't know at the time, and what made gave our research great significance, was that the same genes that control the way a fruit fly embryo develop also operate in humans. And not only do they operate in human development, but also play major roles in diseases. And that realization has been a product of the past 20 years. It's been a set of experiments that has given our work great significance. It's something that I couldn't have anticipated.
Well, that gives me to a very good point, really, which is, I think that you mentioned the atomic bomb, right? But has any of you got a feeling that society should impose restraints, or that scientists should impose restraints on themselves? Yes, go on.
I think you have to understand how science works before you start talking about constraints on science. I mean, it's a huge. It's not a few individuals like the people up here that result in all of the progress in science. It's a huge community of people, and for every one of the prizes that's represented up here on stage, there were many, many smaller advances that were required in order to allow that to proceed.
Yes.
And frequently you don't know what the results of an experiment will be.
All right. Okay. John?
Well, I mean, part of your question, the sword of science has two edges, and they're equally sharp. I mean, you can cut to heal, and you can cut to kill. And so if you ask us, are we more likely to produce good or bad technologies, we are going to produce both.
Okay.
And then, as citizens, we are going to try to control that outcome.
Okay.
Yes.
Identify yourself.
I'm Stephen Weinberg, Nobel laureate in physics, 1979. I've agreed with most of what the panelists said, but I'd like to say something that probably they won't all agree with. It seems to me we're talking about the value of science in the past century. The greatest value of science over the past century and previous centuries has been that it helps to dissolve religious certainty. We've all seen examples recently of the damage done in the world by people who are certain about their religious beliefs. You have to be pretty certain about your beliefs about a reward in paradise to fly an airplane into a building in America, or to blow yourself up on a street corner in
Israel.
You have to be pretty sure about your reward in paradise.
So you're saying that you're positing scientific certainty against religious certainty.
That's right. I think that it's true that it's not just a problem of Muslim fanaticism. In the West, we have Christian fanatics who blow up abortion clinics. But I do think that the hold of religious dogmatism has weakened in the West, and it's largely due to the influence of science. And it's not so much that scientific discoveries disprove religious teachings. It's true they do disprove some very naive religious beliefs about the origin of species or the origin of the earth. But much more important, it seems to me, is the example that science provides of living with uncertainty. That we have our heroes, for physicists, our Newtons and our Einsteins, but every physicist today understands nature better than Newton and Einstein did. We don't have prophets whose words are taken as sacred and infallible. And we expect that our successors will understand nature better than we do.
It's a process. Thank you, Mr. White. I want to go to Liam first. Come on.
We talked about, you wanted some applications of science, and I think it's important to realize that there are many things that scientists uncover which require an understanding on the part of the non-scientists. I mean, medical science can give you longevity, increased longevity and health and nutrition, but then there is a population explosion. And the population explosion is not something for the scientists to solve. In many, many other examples, it's not for the scientist to solve the problem. That requires, on the part of scientists, an enormous effort to communicate, to educate, to make the common, ordinary people in democratic societies understand the issues.
Okay.
So
population. Right.
Population.
There's somebody in the audience, Mr. Fisher. You have a word about population. You got the answer.
The big problems that will come in the rest of the century are problems that will have to be solved, I'm afraid, mostly by chemists and biologists, because indeed, nowadays, about 750 million persons are chronically undernourished, and about 200 million children are on the verge of starvation.
But science is encouraging population growth.
What science has to do is that agricultural environment has been taxed to its limit, and the food production is not keeping up with overpopulation. So we'll have to find ways to increase food. This is not my area, by the way.
I know, but Malthus would have argued it was a good thing to let people starve, because otherwise we'll be overpopulated. So where do you stand on this? You're both complaining about overpopulation, and yet you're keeping more people alive, including me.
We will have to control overpopulation by controlling or having birth control, worldwide birth control. It's not enough to control overpopulation in the developed countries. The world is a closed system, and thermodynamics tells you that if the population of the world is 10 times greater in one area of the world, that it will not cover the rest of it. So you have to control worldwide population.
We're in the interaction here. Let's just stick to this point here about how far scientists should go into the political arena. Well, go on, Mario.
Sure. Yeah. What I want to clarify is science itself is neither good nor bad. It depends how it's used. First point. Second point, when we're talking about what's the connection between science and the political arena, scientists themselves don't have any particular expertise in the policy or in values and so on. On the other hand, we are also individuals, have opinions, and do have a social responsibility.
But should we listen to you particularly because you're a scientist, or should we just take you as a citizen?
Oh, you have to listen, particularly when there is a strong connection with science. But you have to discriminate when we're making statements that use the authority of science versus your statements that are just policy or religion-based. You have to listen carefully, but I think we do have something important to contribute. We have heard these ideas before in terms of the method of science and a certain attitude towards knowledge. But certainly many of the political questions we have been raising are not within the realm of science.
Right. Doug.
Look, I personally feel that first of all, that certainly not all scientists are going to be good citizens in the sense that we've been discussing. And this was something that came up at the Lindau meeting 2 years ago. I personally feel that one cannot choose and put forward scientists and support them based on their citizenship abilities or interests or inclinations. You have to get the very best people you possibly can. But as a community, I think we are smart. We are used to dealing with lots of very complex issues. And I think that if a group of Nobel laureates, for instance, agree on something, there probably is some truth in what they say.
Yeah, John?
Well, I just want to go a bit further than people have gone so far. I don't think that scientists as citizens, of course, are contributing a certain level of education, but they are also contributing the culture of science, which is a remarkably decent culture. We're back to Alfred Nobel. I mean, if there is a group of people, as indeed there is in science, which is an international group, and when they're functioning properly, they routinely put truth ahead of personal advantage, which is pretty remarkable. Who else does that? And they also put truth ahead of patriotism. I mean, they accept truth from another country, they accept truth from another ethnic group, When you looked at the Nobel Prize winners at the banquet last night, they came from all over the world. They were all colors and faiths. And so what I'm trying to say is that this group of people, who are not angels, nonetheless represent a culture which is a very civilized one. And we want to bring that to bear in a wider arena.
Should we trust scientists? Could I have on political issues? How many people think we should give special weight to a scientist on a political issue? Most of you are scientists. How many people here? Raise your hand if you think scientists have some special force to bring to politics. I'm raising mine because I do. But in the audience, it's kind of split, really. There's some skeptics in this audience here.
Some people are modest.
He doesn't. Good. Protest.
Are there issues where, in fact, scientists' opinions should be given special weight? And the answer then, I think, would be undoubtedly yes.
Laureate, speak.
I'm Burton Richter, Nobel Prize in Physics in 1976. The scientific community is beginning to broadly grapple with what I call emerging issues, places where scientific information gives you a view of a real problem for the world. One of them, for example, was the ozone hole in Antarctica. Science taught us about that, and governments listened. Freon is banned. The ozone hole is beginning to get repaired. Global climate change is another one where science began to recognize a problem. It is the scientists who raised this issue at Rio in '92, and the governments are beginning to listen. I think one of the problems that the science community has in identifying emerging issues is to find a forum where one can have a dialogue with the politicians. Scientific organizations are trying, and if we could succeed in doing that, then I think science could begin to grapple with a lot of the problems of our world. I don't think overpopulation is a driver. Overpopulation is a consequence of the good that science has done. If you don't care about life expectancies more than 25 years, you wouldn't worry about overpopulation. But this emerging issue thing is becoming more and more important to the science community, and we really need to find a way to engage the politicians.
Okay, that's a good point. A forum. I'm going to come to you, sir. You're on your feet first, and I'm going to come to you. Just a second. You, sir, briefly, please.
I think the whole issue is, do scientists act politically as scientists or as citizens? There are many situations that require technical scientific information which scientists have very, very good primary expertise in. I think society expects them to be as objective as possible. So the issue there is that scientists and citizens can take political issues, but if they allow the political issues to invade their evaluations of certain situations, the credibility of science is lost in the political arena.
A good point. You, sir. Are you on the same point? Yes. Well, stand up. Give him a microphone. You'll both get a chance. I want to speed it up because there's so many good subjects here. Forgive me if I'm cutting you off. Could you get to the point? I'm Charles Towns, Nobel laureate in Physics in 1964. Some of my work led to the laser, and it's been mentioned the laser has some hazards. On the other hand, it's a really fantastic feeling to me when I find the lasers cured somebody's eyes and allowed them to see and so on. Also, science, there are two aspects here. Science teaches us new possibilities. We understand the world better. We can do new things and new kinds of things. But that's not the whole story in civilization. The other part of it is a sense of values. What to do. Not only be able to do things, but what to do. And scientists both need those sense of values, and science itself has a kind of a sense of value and objectivity and truth and so on. But there are other values which we need to think about very carefully. Furthermore, our society needs to understand more of science because science can have such an enormous effect on it. Our society generally needs to try to understand science and apply their sense of values and see that science gets used in the right way. Well, you're on this point, will you, sir? Yes, well, give him the microphone. Everything must be crisp. Thank you. Give this young fellow in the second row there.
Discussion of the relation between, Kenneth Arrow, Economics 72. I'm afraid my being a rather grubby point as an economist might The idea of whether of the relation between science and politics is a little misleading. There's no choice. The fact is that science is largely driven by government funding. As we all know, government funding is a matter of political policy. Political policy is the result of pushing and hauling, in which, of course, the scientists do a great deal of their pushing.
You approve of the scientists getting involved in that process?
It's not a question of approving. I'm saying the issue is
inevitable.
Exists.
Right.
Therefore, the direction in which various scientific efforts can be pushed, which ones are emphasized, which ones are not, can't help being involved with the values of the society. There have been a number of references, and one could add to them, to the frequent bad effects of increased knowledge. Knowledge increases capability, but capability, as pointed out, is a two-edged sword.
Yeah,
it can cut into both directions.
What's the difference between, let me ask this question very briefly, government funding and corporate funding? Which is the more restrictive and inhibiting, or more affects the values?
Both is the answer to your question. They're restrictive in different ways. The government funding, of course, has been broader in terms of fundamentals, as it has to be. A corporation is in business for profit. And we see, as we go on to a more competitive world, we've seen the decline of some of the great corporate laboratories of the past, which were based on monopoly power.
I've seen a decline also in the sharing of scientific information.
That is a that's not a point I was going to make, but it's an extremely serious point.
Right.
I think that the whole question of intellectual property is imposing, and especially in biology, is imposing great restrictions. Well,
so I think you made the point rather well. Sir?
You brought up the question of who is picking up the bill, funding, government or corporate. Let me say I do believe in true love, not just sponsored love. Look, science can do a lot, even with very modest means. I started and grew up under very poor condition in a poor country, and I still did science. So what I'm simply saying is we shouldn't leave the impression that scientists basically are just hired hand who do whatever the sponsor is willing to pay. Sure, in some areas, high energy physics, many areas, you need big facilities. But I think science is driven by curiosity. And they do science because they believe in it. Even in unpopular field, where it's difficult to get funding. The last remark I have, I was fortunate to get this prize. And maybe Alfred Nobel is somewhat pleased that I spent some of his Nobel money to sponsor my research.
That's paranormal. That's his area. Here we are.
I think that there's another aspect. I think scientists, we talked about the responsibility of scientists, and one of the things that scientists have to be responsible for is science itself. And the scientist is a heritage of, hundreds and hundreds of years. And all of us, no matter what our specialty, have a key to that vast amount of our heritage of knowledge, and that responsibility, I think, drives the issue of whether scientists are going to be political or not political. You can't avoid using that information, even if it's not a technical issue.
Right.
It's a political issue. You've got to, I think, create allies by disseminating the scientific culture. That's again, if it's a culture, it has to be something that we can draw everyone into that culture.
This is the special Nobel Science debate on the centennial of the Nobel Prize Awards in Stockholm. BBC World Service. Welcome back to the Nobel Prize Science debate here in Stockholm, where we've been discussing with laureates in science the role and the responsibilities of science. Now, I had a couple of people in the audience. John, I'm going to come back. I missed you, sir.
I'm Richard Ernst, chemistry, 1991. I have the feeling that so far it wasn't stressed enough that our major impact on society actually goes through the education of the leaders of society itself, through our students, and in that respect it's very important that we don't educate so much specialists, but broad-minded people who can carry responsibility for society.
I see. So are you arguing for a broad general scientific knowledge or just for a liberal education?
For a broad education at universities, so broadly minded people, which needs broadly minded
educators. Good, interesting point. I'm sure we've got two people who want to comment on that.
Just a brief addition to that comment. I think what is very important is to talk in general about the method of science, the scientific method, not just the litany of scientific findings, and that's what society very often is missing.
Yeah, I agree 100% that I think if scientists, as we almost concluded, must get involved in activities which are related to science but not strictly science, they need the education for that, which really means a broad liberal education, liberal arts education for future scientists, for future citizens in general. We've really got to raise the level of our interest in this problem.
I just wanted to say that we haven't mentioned how important the element of freedom is in making discoveries, and maybe it relates to what you were saying. But we talked about curiosity-driven discovery process, and I think actually that's misleading. The cognate term for curiosity is idle, and we do not, the people here, pick our problems in science idly. We pick them with the greatest care because we know that most of what we attempt is going to fail. And you have to find a place where, at a given moment, which is the moment when you're alive and doing science, there can be a breakthrough. And this is an exquisitely careful decision. So it's not controlled by curiosity, which is idle. It's controlled by a perception of where nature will allow a discovery at any given time. And so where does freedom come in? Freedom is needed so that we can sort of attack where the enemy lines are weak.
Well, but Thomas Edison, when he set up his lab in New Jersey, said to his fellow workers, gentlemen, we're not going to be like those German scientists forever studying the fuzz on a bee. He said we have to find practical applications. Are you suggesting practical applications?
No, not in the least. I think the thing you quoted said to me, we're not going to be pedantic. We're not going to go down a list systematically, because that way you don't make discoveries. You have to know what it is you are looking for. You have to have a perception of what can be discovered at this particular moment. And you have to be given the freedom to make the decision, this is what I will do, and I'll stick to it for 10 years, which is very different from curiosity, by the way.
Are you allowed to do that at your university?
I do it, whether allowed or not.
You can comment on him, but I'll go back to the audience again briefly. Yes.
I disagree with John because I also want to make a confession. I'm a very selfish individual. Look, I'm selfish because I follow what I am interested in. Whether it has any benefit to mankind or any general interest and so on at this stage is not in the equation. Look, painters paint because they have a desire to put something on canvas.
Right.
Whether this is of any interest of anybody else, I don't know. I really do believe, however we call curiosity, to me curiosity is not idle. Curiosity is something, you have something in yourself and you fail, and many times, of course, it's a flop.
Many times.
Many of the ideas I thought are good ideas turn out to be flop.
You know, Michelangelo did not paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel out of curiosity.
Because he had a sponsor.
Because he saw an opportunity for painting
He had a
masterpiece.
sponsor who insisted that he should paint the ceiling.
Right, he did indeed. Yes, you sir, you sir, then you sir. Are you a Michelangelo expert? No. Okay, come on. Give him the microphone, then we'll come back to you, sir. All right, go on. He's nearer.
Samuel Ting.
No, wait a minute. You first and then you. Go on.
Samuel Ting, Nobel laureate in physics, 76. I want to make a comment about what was discussed about science and politics.
And politics.
And politics.
Right.
I think we, particularly with regard to this gathering, we received a Nobel Prize for a particular contribution in a fairly restricted field. And this does not necessarily mean we suddenly, because we receive a Nobel Prize, we know things better than other people. Certainly in my case, that's not up.
It's very modest of you to say so.
And so I just want to mention.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. It's raising a very good point, which will come to how far, actually, scientists are qualified to go beyond their speciality. Yes, sir.
I'm Prigozhin, Chemistry 77. I want to make a few remarks. The first thing, over my long life, I've seen science developing enormously. I don't believe that we are very close to the end, because the idea of complexity, of nonlinearity, are still very unknown subjects. Now, what I would like to say is the danger which I see today for science is the increase of choice of technological aspects. I have been one of the founders of European Science, European Union Science Division, and I see how difficult it is now to obtain anything which is long range or anything which seems too theoretical. The grants go always to things which are of direct application, and in fact, I think that if Einstein would have lived today, he would not have the grant for general relativity. Now, I want also to say that I'm very disappointed from another point of view. I say after the Second World War, after the Moscow change, after the Berlin, I always thought that we go to a period of peace. And in fact, this is not so. We are in a more dangerous world than ever.
Right.
When I was younger, I hoped that there will be no more nuclear weapons. But today we have nuclear weapons everywhere. So there is something which science has to act on politics. And this is perhaps the most important aspect at the moment. We, in a sense, seem to be helpless and hopeless in acting on some aspects of society which are perhaps between the most dangerous.
All right, 2 points there. Would it not be true to say, thank you very much, just to ask this generally, would it not be true to say, I'm interested, our friend says that nowadays there's more and more insistence on getting a result, and therefore the de-emphasis on pure science. And at the same time, I have to comment that it's a historical fact, I am a historian, that war has been the greatest progenitor of new advances and discoveries. Now, I'm not suggesting this is an argument for war. It's a simple fact. So, what do you make of that?
I think...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I certainly think untrue was my answer.
No, not true. Well, you can come back and say that more loudly when he said it first. Okay. Now, give him the microphone, but you say it first. Let me stay with Mario and then come back to you.
My name is Robert Curl, Chemistry 96. I don't think your premise is true that war has been a great progenitor of scientific discovery. Can you name some examples?
Give me notice of the question. I want to get other people to speak first. I can, yes I can. But I mean, if you just take, for instance, the present fighting which is going on, and or if you take the history of medicine in World War II and the progress in antibiotics after Fleming and so on, enormous acceleration in antibiotic research to deal with wounded people, advances in surgery to deal with war. I mean, the list is endless, frankly, but I don't want to... He's going to make the same point, probably. I don't want to be accused here of being a warmonger. Come on.
Let's begin, everybody, and we couldn't have this meeting without air travel. Air travel started commercially after World War I, when Pan Am and KLM Airlines started in 1919. Direct result of wartime development of the first piston aircraft.
Thank you very much.
Then in World War II, we got the jets, and now this meeting would not have been possible
without
jet traffic. Professor Towns mentioned the laser. In the early 60s, it was mostly supported by military funding because they saw the possibility of a new weapon. But if you actually now look at the markets, most of the users of lasers are for civilian needs and have improved the condition of mankind.
Reading the barcode.
And the market is such that now 80% of the commercial, of the laser market is for civilian purposes and not for military.
Very good.
I'm certainly all for very basic and fundamental research, and there should be plenty of funding for that. On the other hand, the line between applied and basic research sometimes is fuzzy. So I think it's also the case that there is some fairly applied research that one can show that one can do first-rate science as well with that. So it's not easy to discriminate or to say you should only fund one type or the other. In general, you should fund excellent science, and very often it cuts both ways.
Doug?
I would just like to point out, I think what's true is that the armies and defense organizations have done an awful lot of development of technologies, but I very much doubt that very many basic discoveries have been made as a result of those sorts of pressures. Probably quite the opposite. There's been a tremendous focus in certain directions. But why don't we ask Charles Towns why he invented the laser and the maser? He's sitting right there.
Okay, ask him. Why did you do it? Come on. Give him the mic. And then you. Because we've got two... yes, what?
Definitely for scientific purposes. I wanted to make some new measurements. I wanted to make new measurements. And I wanted to develop the laser for scientific purposes, and it's been a very tremendous scientific tool.
You can read the barcode with the laser.
Now, I would also like to emphasize that, look, science, basic science is exploration. And you don't know what you're going to find. And nobody else knows what you're going to find. Things that are new are things that are unknown at the time. If you take, for example, Columbus, he was trying to get to India for trade purposes and so on. He was exploring. What did he find? Something completely different. And that's typically what science does,
right,
whether supported by the military or industry or anything else. If you're exploring, you're going to find out new things, and that's the excitement.
Okay.
It gives us new possibilities, and many of them will be quite unexpected and not the result of just what you're trying to look for or somebody's trying to get you to look for.
Yes, you're trying to get to Stockholm.
And this was characteristic of the laser. The laser came out exactly that way.
John, the young fellow at the back, and then I'll come back to you, because you're laser too, I know. Are you laser there? No. No, never mind. Explain.
But I have 2 points to make relevant to the discussion. The first is about the funding of science. My Nobel Prize is in chemistry. My name is Aaron Klug, and it's one of 9 which our laboratory has earned over the last 40 years. And the reasons for these Nobel Prizes come because we're allowed, by public funding, to look at long-term problems with no end in view. And yet many ends have come in view. DNA sequencing, my colleague Fred Sanger, his second Nobel Prize in DNA sequences transformed what we know. He didn't start out to do that, to sequence the human genome. The second point is the business about the competence of scientists. The man over there said he was a limited field. Well, most of us work in limited fields, but there are bodies of scientists, academies. I was president of the Royal Society for 5 years recently. My colleague Andrew Huxley preceded me, and we did touch on many issues, educating the public, and we haven't got time to go back to the schools when these issues arise. So you have to do the best you can with parliamentary committees, and we managed in Britain to get stem cell research through the government, through Parliament. And I think we're in the lead, and took a lot of work, speaking, teach-ins, things of that sort. And that was preceded 10 years before by getting the human fertilization embryos built through and teaching the public that the fetus was not the same as an embryo. The embryo, the 14-day rule came about because we told the public, and to a picture, this 14-day was a little worm with a streak down the middle, the primitive streak, yes, the beginning of the nervous system. Those are the kind of things you have to battle with. And in other words, you have to engage in scientific aspects of public policy, right, and scientists do that.
One thing that was touched on but really hasn't been stressed, and it's the hardest thing for scientists to do, and is that to educate the public about the possibility of what good might come. It's very hard for people to see what good might come. It's easier to educate people about dangers that you see in front of you, like the ozone. And this goes directly on bearing of stem cell research and everything else. It's you mentioned cadavers. 500 years ago, you'd be put in prison for opening cadavers. It's very hard for people to understand desecrating the human body could lead to surgery. And I think a similar thing occurs now with stem cell research.
So where does it take you on what your attitude?
As scientists, we really, those who really know about it have to educate the public about the good that can come of it, because it's an ethical issue that if you slow it down, you are killing people.
A friend of mine went to see one of the leading senators against stem cell, and the senator said, before we begin the discussion, let us go on our knees to pray. How do you cope with that?
I think this is something where you pit scientists against ethics, and I say as a scientist, it is an ethical issue. If you don't do this research, people in the future will die.
Very good. Listen, we're going to running out of time here. I've spoken to you once. Have you had two people who have not had a shot? Yes, we have to be very quick now because time is inflexible. You've understood that, right?
My name is Stan Prusner, medicine, 1997. I just want to say that I think that in this increasingly technologic world we live in, this smaller and smaller world, we're going to see government coming to scientists to answer questions that come up continuously. And government is going to need to sponsor more and more basic research to have this base of knowledge from which these questions can be answered. Two very quick examples. Mad cow disease is one. The second one is all the bioterrorism that's going on now. We need all of the basic science in order for the scientists to be able to tell the governments what to do. And I think we're going to see this increasingly as time goes on.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry if I seem a bit brisk occasionally. I want to just get people in. Yes, you, sir, with the blue shirt.
Chemistry, 96. I think the problem is that science is apolitical. It's ethically neutral. It's the way that society decides to use it. That's the technology. And that's the important point. If society decides to use those technologies for war, or it decides to use it for good, then we all have to play a part in making those decisions and advising those who use it and decide to use it. That's particularly government, our societies, Greenpeace and others, to ensure that they understand those technologies as well as they can. Unless they know them and understand, as we in this community do, they'll make bad decisions. And that's, I think, what most scientists believe.
That's a very useful point. And I'm sorry, I can't go to more people. We've had a wonderful discussion from this brilliant panel, and also from a very lively audience who've helped to extend it. And as you say, we've been all over the map. We've visited some interesting places. I'd like to give another prize to all these people here, the gratitude of the millions that we can't see who will somewhere have listened today. And thank you very much indeed. In fact, I'd like to say it in Swedish, tack awaya. And now from the Swedish Parliament in Stockholm, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prizes, goodbye.